exclusive view. Any questions, let me know. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. Let me back that up.
Oh, it is later than I thought. It's gonna have to be a little while.
Dan, can you tell the camera who you are?
Okay, my name's Dave Doucette. This is First Parish in Framingham. It is a late night after doing a fundraiser dinner, and this was afterwards, but the dinner ran late, so there's a bunch of people in the kitchen cleaning up. So in any case, the talk is carbon tax, trade-offs and opportunities. This is actually the third time I've done the presentation. The other two times are also in this church. One was at a service over the summer. The other one was at a meeting at 350.org.
Oh, it's the same
So
one?
I was requested to do this as part of that.
Oh,
And
it's the
again.
same one. I heard it. In that case, I'm gonna go take out that heard.
Okay, that's fine, Stan.
Okay.
Take care.
Yeah, I get it.
Okay, so let's talk about the history of carbon and the use of fossil fuel. In the beginning, basically, you had the Drake oil well, which was mocked up here and recreated in Pennsylvania in 1859. That started a true industrial revolution. The first gas automobile in Germany was 1879, 20 years later. Obviously, the Wright brothers in 1903, and the Ford factory in 1913. What's interesting to look at as far as this slide goes is you have the Drake oil well. This was considered state-of-the-art in 1859. And this, 1913, the Ford factory was considered state-of-the-art, and it shows a dramatic leap within one generation, about 50 some odd years, on how technology, or 60 years, how technology evolved so rapidly with the introduction of carbon fuels. And it just was a sea change technology leap for mankind. Compare that to where we are today, and we are not in such good times. What I'm calling basically is the end game of carbon fuels. We have passed what's known as peak oil. That doesn't mean we're running out of oil. It means that what's left isn't cheap, and the price will continue to increase over time. And then also the other aspect of this is that oil demand is actually increasing worldwide. What used to be non-players in demanding carbon fuels are now demanding more and more carbon fuels on the national scene. That's driving up prices overall. So really, peak oil production, we're kind of plateauing at that. We're not getting the massive growth that we used to have before. And that means that the oil is no longer cheap. Demand is increasing because there's a global market. And the result is price increases because of the basic laws of supply and demand. If there's more demand than there is available production, price increases. That shouldn't be surprising for anyone. Okay? And here's a graph of carbon fuel prices rising. Okay? What's important to note out is between 1998, and this is all from the EIA, Energy Industry Association. It's the Federal Energy Committee. I forget the name of it. Agency. 1998. Here are the prices. Here, $2.49, $1.30 for gas. Home heating oil is 48 cents. Jet fuel, 45 cents. When you get into 2013, this is a tenth of a ton of coal is now $6, where it used to be $2.45. Natural gas is up to $12.16, where it used to be $7.45. Gasoline's pretty much tripled in price. Heating oil has more than tripled in price, more like quintupled. And jet fuel has gone from 45 cents a gallon to $2.96 a gallon. The catch as far as natural gas goes, in 2008, this is really the introduction of fracking and how it impacted the cost of natural gas. So if it wasn't for fracking, cost of natural gas would also continue on this accelerated increased pace. So the other issue is climate change. There's lots of coverage in climate change as far as the issues are. The TV show Cosmos that was out in 2014, they did one episode, absolutely brilliant episode on climate change. It was episode 11. There's been documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth that Al Gore did, and Chasing Ice, which was, if you haven't seen Chasing Ice, you should. It describes the decline of glaciers worldwide. It's a staggering documentary. I've actually done my own documentary. This is available on YouTube, called Tale of the Northwest Passage, and it demonstrates how within 150 years the dramatic change in climate within the Northwest Passage. And if you really look at what's going on, what's out there, you know, there's more than enough to drive someone crazy as far as the evidence that's out in the media for presenting climate change. And you get the responses on the conservative side, and it's stuff like, you know, there's a war on coal. Okay, these are their words. Okay, drill baby drill, which is basically arguing that we need to drill more to get more energy. There's plenty of oil, which is the half truth. It's just that it's not cheap anymore. You know, they deny climate change because it snowed last winter. Oh, that's really good. And climate change is the result of nature and not civilization. The final one, which is the most current, is I'm not a scientist who can speak about climate change, which if you start listening to some of the politicians, they're actually saying things like that. Unfortunately, the response we have at our end, at the other end, the other one is, it's the other political party that's anti-science. You know, they continue to repeat that as well. And the response is, unfortunately, a bunch of comedians who probably do the best job as far as calling these guys on what they're talking about. And honestly, that demonstrates on how bad the media is as far as covering what's actually going on in this space. So there are issues of fossil fuel use. First is the emissions into the atmosphere. Everyone understands that these emissions cause issues. There's the environmental impact, which is climate change, as well as drilling and mining resulting from that. There's also a health impact because of increased respiratory diseases and increased cancer rates from the use of these fuels. And there's also very limited regulations outside of developing nations. We in the United States have a very structured regulatory for emissions and all that stuff. Even though there are some people that are trying to break it down, in other countries they don't even have that. So it's something that is definitely an issue, like the issue of what happened with China during the Olympics a couple of years ago. But the other issues of fossil fuel use is that these are limited resources, and there's no more cheap stuff left. Okay, the price is going to continue to increase. The controlling the resource is global power. Okay, the Middle East is one of the wealthiest spots in the world, and the only thing that they have going for them is the oil. The largest companies in the world, the most profitable companies in the world, are mostly oil companies. They are also the largest contributors in elections, not in the United States, but in other countries. And obviously, they're able to afford the most effective lobbyists that money can buy. And this stems from the concept that energy has to come from a resource that needs to be mined and refined. What we have here is effectively a carbon fuel colossus that poisons our civilization and powers our planet. And it's a global entity that very much reflects the behemoth that was described as far as what was happening in Germany in World War II. And it's a very destructive socio-political force that is run rampant within society. But there's good news out there, and this is not necessarily covered very much. First off is carbon dioxide emissions are declining, not only within the United States, but also within Massachusetts as well. Okay, other developing nations are also making progress, specifically Germany, who has actually developed and deployed more solar panels in Germany than pretty much any other country, except that they're actually further north than most of the United States. And what they're finding is that when they actually spend the effort to address climate change, it has an economic benefit. It creates jobs. And we're going to get into that more and more as we get later in the presentation. Because the bottom line is a good carbon tax is a jobs bill. It creates jobs. So what is a carbon tax? First, it can help address our energy and climate crisis. If you assume that the global climate is warming and this temperature rise is resulting from our civilization's emissions, then a carbon tax is a good idea. If, on the other hand, you don't agree with that, then why do you want to bother with carbon tax? I'm being very, very authentic with that. A carbon tax is based upon emissions per ton, so that coal does get hammered in the carbon tax because it does emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And as far as the war on coal goes, then yeah, carbon tax is very much of a war on coal. It's also what I call anti-Tea Party, because it's a tax on fuel. And if you have someone in the Tea Party saying, drill baby drill, and you're going to tax that stuff, first off, it's a tax. Secondly, it's against that. So flat out, it's anti-Tea Party. But it also invests in community jobs through tax structure, which is another thing that the Tea Party doesn't like. Okay, so let's talk more about what a carbon tax can do. General rules. The tax fuel is based upon emissions, which is dollars per ton of carbon dioxide emissions. The more CO2 emissions from the fuel, the higher the tax. It does not impact renewable, alternative, or nuclear energy. They don't emit carbon dioxide emissions. They're not affected by the tax. Okay? But the thing about a carbon tax is if emissions decline, which we're actually on the downward trend to do that, but as emissions decline, the revenue from the tax will actually decline as well. So once you wrap your head around that, you may be able to convince a couple of conservatives that a carbon tax makes sense. A few of them. But the cost impact, natural gas actually has the least impact as far as cost, because it uses the less carbon dioxide emissions. Gasoline and liquid fuels do get impact, but not as more than natural gas. But the catch is like, jet fuel can't be taxed by the state. That's a federal regulation. That was passed a long, long time ago. So you can't do anything to impact jet fuel. Home heating oil and diesel are effectively the same fuel. But the difference is home heating oil has no sales tax, while diesel has a transportation tax of 68 cents per gallon. And both of them are number 2 fuels. So you have this type of dichotomy already in the market. The other aspect is cost impact is coal, and the last one is wood. Wood is a very interesting case. A lot of proponents of wood burning argue that it's a renewable resource, but you got to be careful with wood, because if you start consuming more and more wood, you could actually get yourself into deforestation. So you can't say have everyone go to wood and replace their their oil burning furnaces with wood, because we just don't have enough wood, to last for that. So why do a carbon tax? Well, here are the pro arguments. The emissions are causing climate change. The fuels are being imported from unstable regions around the world. There's a lot of strategic, and a lot of people are very concerned about the amount of oil that comes out of the Middle East and how that impacts the political stability of the world. The other thing is drilling and mining causes catastrophic environmental damage. And the age of cheap fossil fuels are over. So those are all proponents that say we need to start taxing stuff to get out of it, because we really do need to find a replacement for energy sources. The against arguments include it increases the cost of energy. A lot of people argue that the prices of carbon fuels are high enough. Well, they're going to continue to go up no matter what we do. So the question is, how can we get ahead of the game to try to get beyond this so we don't have to use as much? Another argument is that a carbon tax will impact the lower income and the poor more than other parts of the economy, other parts of society. A lot of people say that phasing out carbon fuels is expensive to do, and that's not necessarily true. And they also argue that renewables are unreliable. You know, like there's solar panels on this roof. It is now almost 10 o'clock at night. We're not getting energy from these solar panels. So why deploy them to begin with? Well, over a year, if you take into account the amount of energy that we're consuming, that's generated by these panels, not only do they pay for their own deployment, but our electrical bills have been going down to zero for most of the year. So it's been very beneficial for the time, even that the renewable systems are online and generating power. So there is already some carbon taxes in place. The latest Harvard magazine had actually a cover article called Taxing Carbon, which if you go to Harvard magazine, you can check it out. This would be the August or September version of 2014. Massachusetts has what's known as the Renewable Energy Trust, which means that a small percentage of electrical bills fund programs for alternative and renewable energy programs to help save electrical generation. Okay, that small amount that's been going on since 1998 has made Massachusetts the most energy efficient state in the nation because of that program. In Colorado and California, some areas of Colorado, some municipalities are thinking of putting a carbon tax. In California, they've been debating whether to do a carbon tax or cap and trade, which are just different approaches to handle carbon tax. Most of the ones I've seen in those, they're pretty much focused on taking the money and including it within the general income of the state, which has its own political issues. In Australia, they actually passed a carbon dioxide emission, a carbon tax in 2012, where the revenue went for general income, and it was a very bad carbon tax. It had more holes in it than Swiss cheese. I believe gasoline wasn't covered because the number of people that have to travel so far in Australia is so high they didn't want to tax gasoline. So it was very restricted as far as what the tax could cover. And it turns out that Australia is actually the second biggest emitter of carbon dioxide per capita in the world. And in 2014, the Conservative Party ran against the carbon tax, saying the carbon tax was ineffective. And they won. And they appealed the carbon tax. And what it demonstrates in Australia is that a bad carbon tax can actually do more bad than good. Because what ends up happening is the political forces then take over and do not allow another carbon tax to go for God knows how many more election cycles. In Germany, they've been funding a lot of renewable energy programs. They recognize that all this energy is being imported into their nation, and alternative energy and renewable energy programs reduce those imports. That helps the economy in general. It also increases jobs because people are actually deploying this infrastructure. So that it increased in large economic growth. And then the poster child is British Columbia, where the carbon tax is actually part of an energy plan dating back to 2007. Now when people talk about the carbon tax, they say, oh, British Columbia has a carbon tax that gives the people the money back. That happened once, maybe twice, within the time it's been there. But now what's happening is the money is actually used for rebates for citizens to basically pay for alternative renewable energy programs. And basically the carbon tax is funding carbon emission reduction programs. And there is actually a alternative energy tax refund that is funding a company, helping to fund a company called General Fusion, based in Burnaby, British Columbia, to help develop a new way of doing fusion research. All that's through the British Columbia side. So let's talk about what is the goal of the carbon tax. An economist would basically say redistribute capital to address climate concerns. So that's a very heady way to say. Another way is to develop a government program to address climate change. Both of those, Tea Party people would basically gag them. So, but the intent is to try to come up with a way to address carbon, the emissions that are going on. So, if we're going to do a carbon tax impact, here's what it would be on fuel prices. What's important in this slide is right there, okay, because basically at $25 a ton, and these numbers might make a little more sense in a couple more slides, but at $25 a ton for carbon tax, that effectively doubles the price of coal. So when you say coal, there's a war on coal and a carbon tax is part of the war on coal, yes, that's true, because a carbon tax could effectively double the price of coal, if not more. But on the other hand, at $25 a ton, price of natural gas has gone up 12%. All the other ones are like 6 or 8%. So you can understand what the differences are as far as percentages. So carbon tax on non-coal fuels, because you take coal out of the picture, then it's a better way to look at the graph. And we've talked about two things. First of all is in the last Massachusetts legislation that's ending this year, there was a proposal to do $5 a ton. This is how it would impact the cost of natural gas, gasoline, and jet fuel, which is basically 1-2% type of range. If you listen to some economists talk about carbon tax, they talk about something around $35 a ton, and that's somewhere between the 10 to 20% range in the increase of price. So if you're talking about 10 to 20% increase in price, you compare that to something like, where the price had been over the last 10 years, we've tripled in price. So there's a different scale involved here as far as what the carbon tax will impact the cost. Okay? But the thing is, energy is not just from fuels. Okay? Fossil fuels do release energy. Renewables actually capture energy from the environment. And it's really distributed energy. Okay? Using renewable energy or deploying renewable energy is like the difference between centralized computing and distributed computing. Once upon a time, all the computers were done using mainframes. I have a computer IT background. And then we went into a server mentality where you have a whole bunch of servers all over the place, and then you end up with these servers that are in your pocket. They're called smartphones. But right now computing power is cheap. But when it was centralized with the mainframe, it was very expensive. And when you start deploying renewable energy, this distributed energy is going to drive cost of energy down. Okay? Because the more that gets deployed, the more energy is generated, the less use of fossil fuels. The only catch is that renewables really can't replace fossil fuels. They're good to help phase them out, but you're not going to strangle out the last part. The other key is that the deployment of this renewable infrastructure does require money. There has to be investment involved. But the tax structure is now more towards doing investments in carbon fuels. So you have to look into energy technology, investing in alternative energy technologies that can phase out what I call heavy carbon fuels, which effectively be everything but natural gas. Okay, fuel cells are actually very good for that. They're already used in transportation, heat and electricity for the home. Methane as energy storage, that's being explored. There's a pilot program in place in Germany for this. It's based upon some pioneering work that was done in the early 1900s by a chemist called Sebater, who developed a way to take hydrogen and combine it with carbon dioxide with a catalyst to create methane. Because it's a catalyst involved, it actually doesn't require much energy to do the translation or the morphing into methane. So you end up spending a lot of money doing electrolysis. But for backup and to capture energy from renewable energy sources, that's actually a very interesting way to do it, because now you're generating fuel from excess energy from an infrastructure, from renewable energy infrastructure. The other one to take into account is hydrogen fusion, which has always been a hot button for me, predominantly for electrical utility generation. The use of hydrogen fusion can be a backup for renewable energy sources when they're not generating in full demand. and also it gets us to the planets. One of the things about hydrogen fusion as a propellant, a space propellant, is, chemical technology got us to the moon. Our probes can get to the planets, but, it would be years travel for a human to do it, so it's a different scale. But with fusion, travel to even to the remote planets can be done in weeks. And there's plans in place, the researchers that are working on that already today. So let's get back to what is the goal of carbon tax, which is what I've been really trying to argue about, is the goal of the carbon tax should be to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. If you're going to be spending the money, if you're going to invest and you're going to set up an infrastructure to tax carbon emissions, your goal should be to reduce the emissions and spend the money to do that. And we know how to do that. This has already been proven. These are proven ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. No one's going to argue about this. Deduction and refunds for conservation programs. Insulate your home. That's one of the more effective ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Okay? Renewable energy loans and grants. Put solar panels on your roof. Not everyone can do that, but the ones that do, reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Okay? Support funding of large-scale deployments like Cape Wind or Deep Wind. Look up Deep Wind, by the way. Cape Wind has spent the last 3 years trying to get funding to put up the first wind farm off the coast of the United States. And a lot of the reasons why that's going on is that the financial infrastructure and incentives and tax incentives aren't in place to help renewable programs like that. In the meantime, God knows how many fracking wells were put in place in Ohio. You also have to fund alternative energy research, which includes fusion and fuel cells. But all of this is funding for new jobs. That's the key. You fund on this, you create jobs. So let's get back to what is the goal of carbon tax? A lot of people argue to be revenue neutral. So where does the money really go? Okay? The lower income are more impacted by the increased energy costs, so there has to be some sort of rebate refund program with an earning cap limit. But you have to expect that the income, the annual tax income from a carbon tax would decline over time, so that citizens wouldn't be dependent on some sort of carbon income, which if you go to Alaska and the use of the money from the oil wells of Alaska to help fund the communities and the families in Alaska, a lot of them have become very dependent on the income of that money from oil. The improved efficiency will accelerate the decline. This is not something that's going to be a slow decline, but if you're actually invested right, it's going to start declining even faster. Which, for the people who want to see climate change, this is the best thing that they can hear. But it's also important not to include it as a source of general income. We'll get into that a couple of times as well. This isn't money that just could go into the government. No one likes that idea. Remember back in Australia, that was an important part of that. And there's some people that say, oh, we could take a carbon tax and replace, let's say, the sales of the income tax. The only problem is that the sales and the income, if the carbon tax is declining, then the revenue for the state would be declining as well, for the government. That's just a backhand way to reduce the tax overall. So let's get back to what is the goal of carbon tax? Is the goal of carbon tax pay to pollute? Well, this is another thing about where does the money go? Okay? Important point. Sales tax and income tax are regressive, which basically means as the economy increases, people get paid more. People pay more taxes. People get paid more, they buy more things. Government gets more money from sales tax. That's why they call it a regressive tax. I hope you understand by now that the carbon tax is not a regressive tax because the income is going to decline and there's a very potential of actually declining at an accelerated rate if this is done properly. So there are some issues, what I call the real world gotchas. Price of coal gets hammered. Very late, okay? Price of coal may go up by a factor of 2, if not more. Okay? Home heating oil right now has no sales tax. And over 30% of Massachusetts homes are heated with oil. Oh, by the way, in the last 10 years, with a 3 times rise in home heating oil, resulted in a doubling of homes heated with wood pellets in that same 10 years. So this is demonstrating how an increase in price of fuel has actually increased the emissions over time, because a house that's heated by wood is going to have more emissions than a house heated by oil. The other thing which I talked about before is states can't tax jet fuel because of federal regulations. One way to get around this is to put in place, let's say, an airport gate fee, so that you actually find some way to tax the traffic using air gas. And also, so where does the money go? This is like the last one. This really boils down to 3 basic choices. You can include in general income, say replace the sales and income tax. You can give it back to the citizens, either rebate on carbon improvements or send out checks. The rebate on carbon improvements reductions, or you can fund incentives to reduce emissions through conservation programs, renewable energy, and alternative energy. General survey, most people, no one wants to include it as part of the general income. A lot of people are arguing to include it as part of the citizens, but the incentives to reduce emissions is the only way to guarantee that carbon dioxide emissions will decline over time. And if the goal of a carbon tax is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, some of the funding has to be to basically fund programs to do that and create a job. So, an ideal carbon tax. First is to fund the investments to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, which is to refund alternative energy and conservation programs, and that is to focus on helping the families and small businesses, okay? And also fund alternative energy research, fusion, fuel cell, the Sabeta process. Oh, by the way, MIT's Alcator C lab is the only plasma research lab in the United States that's under operation, and it was shut down for a year and a half because of funding cuts out of Washington. During that time, there was no progress on the research, and that is just one example as far as how bad research into this technology has been. This is the future of mankind, and it's being strangled. You got to provide a rebate for a lower percentage of income, which is money to the people. What that percentage is has to be part of the negotiations, but some of it has to go to the lower incomes. And I think it's very important not to include any of this as part of general income for the government. What's also important is that an ideal carbon tax will phase itself out over time, because as emissions decline, revenue from the tax will also decline. It's also important to point out that an ideal carbon tax would be a jobs bill. So it actually helped the middle class creating new jobs. So with that, other questions and whether or not you'd be supporting a carbon tax? You have a question?
I do.
Yes.
You were saying about how having a carbon tax does not guarantee a reduction in carbon going into the atmosphere. Could you say why that is true?
If a carbon tax is not investing in alternative energy, renewable energy programs, it is not, like if it's a revenue neutral carbon tax where the money goes out to the people are not necessarily going to spend it on ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Okay.
So you can't guarantee, it might go down, but you can't guarantee it.
You can't guarantee it. You can't predict it. You can't predict how much. Okay?
Yeah.
That's what happened in Australia. They thought they could increase the price of carbon fuels and people would stop buying it, stop using it as much. And what they found out is that their emissions actually increased after the first couple of years that I was out. Because the money has to go into programs that specifically target reducing carbon dioxide emissions. You effectively have to put a carrot with the carbon tax stick. And the carbon tax, by just giving the money and saying that it's going to go back to the people, you have the stick and there's no carrot. And that's the big rub. You got to have the incentive programs. The thing is that within Massachusetts, the Renewable Energy Trust demonstrates that this model works. It's been going on with electrical demand, with electrical power now for 16 years, and our electrical power generation has been declining over these years, and our emissions are declining because our electrical power demands have declined. And people are putting in place insulation for their homes, and they're not getting as high, home heating bills, which impacts electrical use, but also impacts, the, fossil fuel use as well.
And it has created jobs.
And it creates jobs.
And you said, you commented about how some people are arguing in favor of just a rebate to lower income people.
No, I'm saying you have to do that. You have to basically cover the lower income.
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that you have to do that and also have an energy efficiency component.
Yes.
So that their energy use goes down.
So that everyone's energy use goes down, not just the poor. I mean, you got to look at it from a social perspective, right? It is true. The lower income, their percentage of income spent on, on energy as a percentage of the total income is much greater than everyone else because there's some minimum that of energy bill that's common for most people today, and whatever they're, whatever they are, that's a big chunk of theirs. But the conservation programs could be for everyone. Doesn't matter whether or not you're making $50,000 a year, or $500,000 a year. If you want to save money, then the program should help you reduce your energy use, your carbon, fossil fuel use. Put on solar panels on your roof. Things like that. Okay. Thank you.